An indifferent millionaire leaves a meeting in a rundown neighborhood when a 7-year-old girl in torn clothes runs desperately toward him, pleading, "Uncle, please come to my house." Reluctantly, he follows her into a shanty town, where he discovers something that shakes him to his core. The heavy, foul air of that Thursday afternoon clung to the expensive fabric of his suit like a filthy, invisible hand. Arthur Sterling felt a single drop of sweat trace a slow path down his temple, an annoyance that compounded the latent irritation. Bubbling in his chest since the disastrous meeting, the rundown neighborhood seemed to conspire to assault his senses. The reek of overflowing dumpsters mixed with rancid grease, the thumping bass of a rap song bleeding from some open window, and the sharp cry of a baby in the distance. He quickened his pace on the cracked sidewalk, his polished Italian leather shoes kicking up a fine dust with every step. The car, a gleaming black S-Class, waited for him at the end of the block like an oasis of silence and air conditioning, a fortress against the squalor that surrounded him. For Arthur, poverty wasn't a cause. It was an inconvenience, background noise he strove to ignore in his perfectly orchestrated life. Complex emotions, unnecessary entanglements, they were weaknesses he had learned to suppress with the same calculated coldness he applied to his business dealings. His childhood, a blur of deprivation and fear he had locked away in the darkest corner of his memory, was the source of this armor. He just needed to reach the car. It was then that a small, fast-moving shape darted out of a narrow alleyway, running toward him with an urgency that made him recoil instinctively. It was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, whose tangled hair framed a thin face smudged with dirt and dried tears. Her clothes, a faded dress torn at the shoulder, barely covered her thin frame. But it was her eyes, large and dark, that paralyzed him for an instant. In them was a despair so pure, so absolute, it looked like an open wound. She stopped abruptly before him, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, and held out a small, trembling hand, almost touching the sleeve of his jacket. "Mister, please, you have to come to my house." Her voice was a thread, hoarse and pleading. "My little brother is real sick." Arthur's first reaction was a profound weariness, a kid begging. He reached into his pocket, ready to pull out a $20 bill and end the interaction. It was the standard procedure, a quick transaction that absolved him of any greater responsibility. But the girl shook her head vehemently, ignoring the gesture. "It's not money, sir. It's my brother. He's burning up with a fever and he won't wake up right. Please." Her insistence was irritating. He had a schedule, commitments, a world of order and efficiency that had no room for detours. This environment suffocated him, stirring up feelings he'd spent a lifetime burying. He wanted to flee, to get into his car and leave this scene behind, as he always did. Yet, something in the child's genuine distress pierced his armor of indifference. It was the way she looked at him, not as a millionaire, a mark, but as the only hope in the world. In that gaze, for a fraction of a second, he saw a distant reflection of himself, small, terrified, and alone. The memory was like an electric shock, subtle but undeniable. A forgotten fiber in his hardened heart vibrated painfully. He let out a sigh, a sound of surrender that surprised him as much as it did the girl. He looked toward the car, the symbol of his escape, and then back at her pleading eyes. Against all logic, against all his instincts for self-preservation, he found himself nodding slowly. The girl, seeing his gesture, grabbed his hand with surprising strength and pulled him toward the alley. Every step into that labyrinth of crumbling tenements was a step away from his secure life, a dive into a past he had sworn never to revisit. He didn't know what awaited him, but he felt, with a disconcerting certainty, that his life was about to be rerouted in a way he could neither predict nor control. The girl's small, rough hand, which he would later learn belonged to a child named Mia, was a disorienting link to the reality he tried to avoid. She led him through a maze of alleys that narrowed with every turn, where the sun barely managed to penetrate. The damp, grimy pavement clung to his shoes, and he had to duck to avoid tangled electrical wires that hung dangerously low. Curious and suspicious eyes followed him from the doorways and windows of the dilapidated buildings, an intruder in a world that was not his. The stench of garbage and decay was almost unbearable, a direct assault on his controlled, aseptic environment. Every step was a test of his resolve, a battle against the primal instinct to turn and run. The girl, however, didn't hesitate. She knew every loose paving stone, every puddle of filthy water, moving with the agility of one born into this chaos. Finally, she stopped before a squalid apartment in a tenement building, its doorway covered by a tattered blanket. "It's here," she whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and hope. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature. The interior was even more desolate than he could have imagined. There was a single room, dark and stifling. The floor was bare, grimy floorboards. In one corner, a hot plate with a pot on it exhaled a murky steam. In another, on a thin, stained mattress, lay a tiny figure. It was the brother, a boy no older than 4, curled in the fetal position. His skin had a feverish sheen, and his lips were dry and cracked. His breathing was a rapid, shallow wheeze. Beside him was a plastic cup with a greyish liquid, the broth Mia had mentioned, and a few wet rags. Arthur moved closer and instinctively touched the boy's forehead. The skin was on fire. This wasn't just a simple illness. It was serious. The helplessness of the scene hit him with the force of a gut punch. 2 children, alone, fighting a severe illness with rags and dirty water. The anger he'd felt earlier, directed at the interruption, now morphed into a cold fury at the raw, absolute injustice of the situation. "We need to get him to a hospital. Now!" His voice came out harsher than he intended, a command born of panic and the need to regain control. Mia just nodded, her eyes full of tears she refused to shed. Without a second thought, Arthur rapped, the boy's feverish little body in a sheet that seemed the least soiled, and lifted him into his arms. The boy was frighteningly light. He marched out of the apartment, Mia at his heels, ignoring the astonished stares of the neighbors. The walk back felt like an eternity, but soon he was placing both children in the back seat of his luxury car. The incongruity of the scene, the pristine cream leather and the 2 figures from a world of privation, barely registered in his mind. He drove with an urgency that bordered on recklessness, weaving through traffic to the nearest private hospital. Upon arrival, his imposing presence and the flash of his money ensured immediate attention. Doctors and nurses rushed the boy, now identified as Leo, into the emergency room. Hours passed in a sterile waiting room, with Mia sitting beside him in an exhausted silence. Finally, a grey-haired doctor approached, his face serious. "We've managed to stabilize him. It's advanced pneumonia, but he's going to be okay." Arthur felt a wave of relief that surprised him, but the doctor continued. "I have to be honest, sir, if you'd waited another day, we might have lost him. This could have been treated with simple antibiotics if he'd been brought in a week ago. The neglect is what nearly killed him." The doctor's words echoed in Arthur's mind, not as an accusation, but as a devastating revelation. This wasn't a twist of fate. It was a failure of a system, of a society, of whatever adult should have been caring for them. He looked at Mia, who was dozing exhausted against his arm. Who was supposed to have protected them? Where were these children's parents? The question hung in the air, heavy and pressing, opening an abyss of new and terrible possibilities. The word neglect hung in the sterile hospital air, heavy and sharp. Arthur Sterling, a man accustomed to balance sheets and market strategies, felt completely disarmed. He had paid the hospital bill without blinking, a sum that was insignificant to him, but had represented the line between life and death for little Leo. Now, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside the hospital bed, he watched the boy sleep, a deep, medicated sleep, his chest rising and falling in a finally steady rhythm. In a chair nearby, Mia, dressed in a new child's pajama set he'd had someone buy, was also sleeping, her head lolling to the side, her face finally serene, free of dirt and despair. The logical thing to do was to call Child Protective Services, hand them over to the system and move on with his life. It was the correct, cleanest procedure. He had already done more than anyone would. But the image of that squalid apartment, of the murky broth, of the rags used as compresses, was seared into his mind. Leaving these children to the mercy of an anonymous bureaucracy felt like a betrayal, a cowardice that, to his own surprise, he couldn't commit. Mia woke slowly, blinking to adjust to the soft light of the room. Seeing her brother sleeping peacefully, a small smile touched her lips, the first Arthur had seen. She looked at him, the gratitude in her eyes almost palpable and more disarming than any accusation. "Thank you, mister," she said softly. Arthur cleared his throat, feeling awkward. "Your brother is going to be fine, Mia." He paused, choosing his words with uncharacteristic care. "Mia, where is your mother?" The girl looked down at her hands, which were fiddling with the hem of her pajamas. "Mommy went to live in heaven, a long time ago." The answer was delivered with a desolate simplicity, an acceptance that hurt more than any tears. "And your father?" Arthur pressed, feeling a knot form in his throat. Mia shrugged, a small, resigned gesture. "Daddy? Oh, he comes by sometimes to get money, but then he disappears again for a lot of days." The casual sentence, almost an aside, struck Arthur like a bolt of lightning. Money? What money? There was nothing in that apartment, absolutely nothing of value. The image of the hot plate and the stained mattress returned with clarity. Where would a man get money from that place? Arthur's mind, trained to find patterns and inconsistencies, began to work feverishly. Was it some kind of government benefit he came to collect? A welfare check? Even so, Mia's description, the sudden appearance, the taking of money, and the disappearance didn't fit. It sounded predatory. It sounded like he was exploiting something or someone. The suspicion, cold and unpleasant, began to settle in his heart. This absent father wasn't just neglectful. There was something more, something hidden and sinister in their family dynamic. He was so immersed in his thoughts that he barely noticed the door to the room opening. A middle-aged woman, with a hospital social worker's ID badge and a clipboard, entered with an air of impatient efficiency. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Helen Davison from Social Services. I was informed about the children's situation. I need to fill out some forms." She looked from Arthur to Mia with a professional, impassive expression. "What exactly is your relationship to them? We need to contact their legal guardians immediately. Without the proper paperwork, we can't proceed with protective measures." The veiled threat in the bureaucracy, the coldness of the system materializing before him, made Arthur's blood run cold. He had no answers. He wasn't a relative, not a legal guardian. He was just a stranger who had gotten involved. And now, he realized with a rising panic, the very system that was supposed to protect these children could be the first obstacle to truly saving them. The social worker's tone was that of someone stamping passports at a dull border crossing. To her, Mia and Leo were not two children who had almost died, but a case number, a set of forms to be filled. "I'm not a relative," Arthur answered, his voice firmer than he felt. "I found them. The boy was very sick." Helen Davison sighed, a sound of professional weariness. "I understand, sir. We appreciate your actions. Now I need the father's information. The girl mentioned a father. Before Arthur could reply, Mia, who had been watching the woman with her large, attentive eyes, said in a low voice, "His name is Ricardo." Helen jotted the name on her clipboard with a pen that made an irritating click. "Right, Ricardo. And an address? We need to send an official notification." Arthur intervened. "I don't think he has a fixed address." "The girl said he just shows up and disappears." The social worker raised an eyebrow. "That complicates things. Standard procedure requires notifying the guardian. Without that, they're in a legal limbo. We'll have to place them in a temporary shelter while we try to locate him." The word shelter sounded like a sentence. Arthur imagined Mia and Leo, fresh from trauma, being thrown into an anonymous, institutional, perhaps even hostile environment. The thought was unbearable. "Is that the best you can do? Put them in a shelter?" he questioned, his frustration bleeding into his voice. Helen stared at him, her patience wearing thin. "Mr. Sterling, there are rules. We can't just hand them over to a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned. I have dozens of cases like this. The system has protocols to protect the children." But Arthur saw clearly that the system was more concerned with protecting itself. The protocols were a barrier, not a bridge. The institutional indifference was a form of violence as cruel as the paternal neglect. He knew that if he let the children be swallowed by that bureaucratic machine, he would lose sight of them, and they would become just another statistic. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. It was impulsive, irrational, but it came from a place of deep conviction. "I'll be responsible for them," he declared. Helen looked at him as if he had just announced he could fly. "You can't. That's not how it works. You'd need temporary custody, a court order." Arthur cut her off, the natural authority in his voice returning with full force. "Then start the process. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll cover all medical and educational expenses, everything. But in the meantime, they will not go to a shelter. They will stay with me." A standoff settled in the room. The social worker, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged with such power and determination, was momentarily speechless. The mention of best lawyers seemed to have a particular effect. She looked at the papers in her hand, then at Arthur, and finally at the two children. Perhaps somewhere beneath the layers of professional cynicism there was a flicker of compassion. The following days were a whirlwind. Arthur moved heaven and earth. His lawyers, used to mergers and acquisitions, suddenly found themselves dealing with family law, filing injunctions and petitions with breathtaking speed. He rented a comfortable, secure apartment near his own home and hired a private nurse and a kind housekeeper to care for the children. Leo recovered visibly, gaining weight and color. Mia, for the first time in a long time, could simply be a child, playing with the toys Arthur bought, in absurd quantities, as if trying to compensate for a lifetime of deprivation in a few days. He visited them daily, feeling strange and awkward in this new role. One evening, as he was reading a story to Mia, a man appeared at the apartment door. He was thin, with hollow eyes, and a smile that didn't reach them. He wore worn-out clothes, and had the air of someone life had battered, or who had battered life. "I'm Ricardo," he said, his voice slick. "The kid's father. I heard some rich guy decided to play the Good Samaritan." He looked around the apartment, appraising every object. "I think it's real noble of you. Rich people like you should help out needy families like mine." His presence filled the room with a palpable tension. It wasn't the gratitude of a relieved father. It was the opportunism of a predator who had scented a mark. The slick, veiled emotional blackmail had begun. Arthur's problem had just been given a face, and it was a calculating, dangerous one. Ricardo's appearance was like a bucket of Cold water on the fragile bubble of security Arthur had tried to build around the children. The man showed no concern for Leo's health or Mia's well-being. His restless, greedy eyes scanned the apartment, calculating the value of every piece of furniture, every toy, every item of clothing. He was the embodiment of the suspicion Arthur had been nursing. "It's very generous of you to take care of my kids," Ricardo continued, his syrupy tone clashing with the hardness in his gaze. "You know, life's been tough for me. A single dad struggling to give them the best. Sometimes a guy just needs a little push." The suggestion was as clear as day. He didn't want his children back. He wanted a slice of Arthur's fortune. Rage, hot and bitter, rose in Arthur's throat, but he swallowed it. He knew any hostile reaction could be used against him. This man was still, in the eyes of the law, the father. "Your children need stability, Ricardo. They nearly died from neglect," Arthur said, his voice controlled and icy. Ricardo gave a crooked smile. "Neglect is a strong word. I do what I can. But with your help, I could do a lot more for them. Maybe a better place to live, some bills to pay, you understand." Arthur understood perfectly. This was extortion. He instructed his lawyers to offer a deal, a generous monthly payment in exchange for Ricardo signing over legal guardianship. It was business, a transaction, the language Arthur mastered. Ricardo accepted the first payment with a delight that turned Arthur's stomach, and then disappeared, just as Mia had described. For a few days, a precarious peace settled. Arthur began to delve deeper into the children's lives. He enrolled Mia in a private school where, despite her initial shyness, she began to blossom. Leo, now fully recovered, was a curious, laughing little boy. During a visit to the old tenement to retrieve some belongings Mia had asked for, a cloth doll with one eye missing and a broken music box, Arthur felt that chill again. The place was empty, but the air seemed thick with secrets. On impulse, he rummaged in a dark corner behind some old crates. That's when he found it. Tucked under a loose floorboard was a small plastic-wrapped package. Inside, white powder and a few small empty baggies. The reality hit him with the force of a punch. It wasn't just neglect. Ricardo wasn't just an absent father. He was using the apartment with the children inside as a stash house. They hadn't just been abandoned. They had been living in a viper's nest. The discovery changed everything. The situation was infinitely more dangerous than he had imagined. Involving the police was a monumental risk. A report could get Ricardo arrested, yes, but it would also expose the children to even greater trauma. They could be taken to the shelter he so feared, or worse, be separated. The system, with its cold, impersonal logic, might not see the difference between a drug-dealing father and an absent one. To the bureaucracy, they might just be different labels for the same parental inadequacy. Arthur felt cornered. His fortune, which had always been the solution to all his problems, now seemed useless against such a complex threat. He was in a silent war, fighting an unseen enemy to protect two children who, in a few short weeks, had lodged themselves in his heart in a way he had never thought possible. Their vulnerability was his own. One afternoon, while picking Mia up from school, the principal called him aside, and for a chat. Her face was pale and worried. "Mr. Sterling, I need to show you something." She handed him a drawing Mia had made in art class. It was a colorful picture of a pretty house with a smiling sun, but in one corner, scribbled in black, were two small, cowering figures and a tall, angry man yelling at them, and next to the man were other men with frightening faces. The childlike simplicity of the drawing made the scene all the more terrifying. The danger wasn't a guess. It was the reality those children had lived, and now, he realized with a growing horror, the danger included him. As he left the school, he noticed two men on a motorcycle parked across the street. they didn't take. Their eyes off him and Mia. They weren't just watching, they were surveilling. The threat was no longer veiled, it was there, in broad daylight, and it had a clear message. The men on the motorcycle made no move. They just watched, their faces hidden by dark helmets, a silent, menacing presence. Arthur quickly buckled Mia into the car, his heart pounding against his ribs. He felt the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure as he drove away, checking his rearview mirror every few seconds until the bike disappeared from view. He tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, paranoia born of his recent discovery. But he knew it wasn't. It was a warning. The atmosphere in the apartment that night was thick with unspoken tension. Leo, oblivious to it all, played noisily with a wooden train on the rug. But Mia was quiet, too quiet. She barely touched her dinner, and instead of asking for a story, she just curled up on the sofa, clutching the one-eyed doll with desperate force. Arthur watched her, a sense of dread growing inside him. The fragile joy he had seen blossom in her over the past few days had withered, replaced by a familiar shadow of fear. He sat down beside her, the distance between them feeling like a chasm. "Mia, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She didn't answer, just shook her head, her face buried in the doll's shoulder. He knew he had to be patient, that forcing her to speak would only make her retreat further. He waited, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of Leo's train on its wooden tracks. Finally, her voice muffled by the doll's fabric, she whispered, "They talked to me." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Who, Mia? The men on the motorcycle?" She nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. "When the teacher wasn't looking. When school let out." The words came out in a hesitant rush, broken by stifled sobs. "They said, they know you're helping me, that you're rich. They said that Daddy didn't like that." She lifted her face, and the sight of her terror-filled eyes was like a knife to Arthur's heart. "They told me to tell you to stop, to not come here anymore, or else they said they'd do something bad, to Leo." The threat, delivered from the mouth of a 7-year-old, was 1,000 times more devastating. They hadn't threatened him directly. They had used the most precious thing in Mia's world against her, her brother. It was a calculated cruelty, designed to terrify and paralyze. A fury unlike any Arthur had ever felt consumed him. A white-hot, cold rage that screamed for action. His first instinct was to call his head of security, to call the police, to crush these vermin. But then he looked at Mia, trembling in his arms, and the rage gave way to a paralyzing fear. He was a giant in the business world, a titan capable of moving markets, but in that moment, he felt utterly powerless. He had brought this danger into their lives. His wealth, his power, his very presence, which should have been a shield, had become the bullseye of a target painted on the backs of 2 innocent children. His generosity had turned into a source of peril. He held Mia tightly, trying to transfer a sense of security he himself did not feel. "No one is going to hurt Leo. No one is going to hurt you. I promise," he murmured, the words sounding hollow in his own ears. How could he possibly keep that promise? If he backed down, he would leave them to the mercy of Ricardo and his associates. If he pushed forward, he could be dragging them into the crossfire. For the first time in decades, Arthur Sterling had no plan. He was trapped in an impossible dilemma, and the price of a wrong choice was the safety of the 2 lives he had, against all odds, come to love. The promise he had made to Mia echoed in his mind, a heavy, almost impossible oath to uphold. Arthur spent the night sleepless, pacing his silent penthouse, the city's skyline of lights seeming to mock his impotence. The world he dominated, the universe of finance and contracts, was governed by clear rules, by calculable risks. But this new territory was a swamp of raw emotion and unpredictable danger. He couldn't just buy a solution. The threat against Leo, delivered through Mia, was a masterstroke of cruelty. It revealed the nature of the men he was dealing with, cowards who used children as shields and weapons. He knew the only way out was the legal one, but the system had already shown him its slow, indifferent face. Still, it was the only path. The next morning, he met with his legal team, men in grey suits and serious expressions, accustomed to corporate battles. He laid out the situation: the neglect, the use of the home for illicit activities, the veiled threat. Their response was disheartening. "Arthur, the word of a child, especially one so young, carries little weight in court without concrete evidence," said the senior partner, Mr. Hayes. "The package you found, you can't prove it belonged to him. He could claim you planted it. The threat, likewise, is your word against theirs. We need something solid, irrefutable." The frustration was a bitter taste in Arthur's mouth. He had all the money in the world, but he couldn't buy justice, the network of protection Ricardo had built around himself, whether through fear or complicity in his community, seemed impenetrable. The attempts to gain legal custody were blocked by a web of bureaucracy and postponements. It seemed that at every turn, a door was slammed shut. The judge on the case seemed strangely reluctant to expedite the process, citing the need to hear the father's side and respect the bonds of blood. Arthur began to suspect Ricardo's influence extended beyond the neighborhood streets. Perhaps his illegal activities had forged connections, favors that were now being called in within the court system. He was fighting a corrupt system from the inside out. Desperate for a new approach, Arthur hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient ex-cop named Silas. Silas's mission was simple: find out everything about Ricardo's life. Who were his associates? What were his sources of income? Where did he go when he disappeared for days? Silas worked silently for a week, diving into the underworld Arthur only knew from the news. The report he delivered was the unexpected turning point, the puzzle piece that altered the course of the story entirely. "This is more complicated than we thought, Mr. Sterling," Silas began, sitting in Arthur's office. "Ricardo isn't just some small-time dealer. He's an exploiter. But that's not the most important part." He paused, looking directly at Arthur. "I looked into the children's past. The mother, the woman Mia said, went to live in heaven. Her name was Claudia. She died 2 years ago from an untreated lung infection. Do you know who Claudia was?" Arthur shook his head, his heart tight. "She was Ricardo's cousin," Silas revealed. "She and her husband, a man named Ben, came to the city looking for work. Ben died in a construction accident shortly after. Claudia was left alone with 2 small children. Ricardo, as the only family nearby, offered to help. The investigator opened a folder and pushed a copy of a birth certificate across the desk. It was Mia's. In the father's name field, it did not say Ricardo. It said Ben Carter. He pushed another one, Leo's, the same name. Arthur's jaw dropped. He looked at Silas, his mind struggling to process the information. "So, he's not their father?" "No," Silas confirmed. "He has no blood relation. He's not their biological father. He inherited them after their real parents, the people who actually cared, were gone. Mia and Leo aren't his children. They're his hostages." The revelation fell on Arthur with the weight of a concrete slab. Hostages. The word echoed in his mind, redefining everything. The neglect, the financial exploitation, the cruelty, it all now made a terrible, perverse kind of sense. Ricardo wasn't a failed parent. He was a usurper, a parasite feeding on a family's tragedy to support his own vices and squalid life. The coldness he showed toward the children wasn't that of a distant father, but that of a jailer toward his prisoners. This discovery, while shocking, lit a new flame of hope in Arthur. The legal battle had just shifted its ground. Ricardo didn't have the primary right that blood confers. He was a fraud. "This changes everything, Silas," Arthur said, feeling The adrenaline of a new strategy coursed through him. We need to prove this in court. The birth certificates are our weapon. Silas, however, maintained a cautious expression. It's a powerful weapon, no doubt, but Ricardo has had de facto possession for 2 years. He presents himself as the father. The community knows him as the father. The bureaucracy, including the welfare benefits he collects in their names, recognizes him as the father. Undoing that lie won't be simple. He'll fight tooth and nail. He'll lie. He'll say Ben gave him the kids on his deathbed. We need more. The fight, therefore, intensified. Arthur was now not just trying to prove Ricardo was an unfit parent. He had to prove Ricardo was an imposter. He threw himself into this new phase, his controlling, methodical personality finally finding a purpose beyond himself. He spent less time in his office and more time at the apartment with Mia and Leo. The feelings he had fought so hard to suppress were surfacing, uncontrollable. They were feelings he didn't know he possessed. He found himself smiling genuinely when Leo managed to assemble a puzzle, or felt an immense pride when Mia read a whole page of a book without faltering. He was learning to braid her hair, a task his large, clumsy hands found nearly impossible, but which he insisted on trying night after night under the girl's amused and patient gaze. They were small, everyday moments that were mending him from the inside. In these moments, the shadows of his own difficult childhood of abandonment and loneliness began to recede, replaced by the light emanating from these 2 children. He was no longer just a protector. He was becoming a father figure, a role he had never wanted and which now filled him in a way his fortune never could. He also realized he needed to understand the environment they came from. With Silas as a discreet guide, he returned to the community, not as a frightened millionaire, but as an observer. He talked to people, owners of small bodegas, mothers, sitting on their front stoops. He wanted to know about Claudia and Ben, the real parents. The stories he heard painted a picture of a loving, hard-working couple who dreamed of giving their children a better future. Claudia was a woman of gold, said an elderly woman, Mrs. Rosa, who sold sweets from a small cart. She lived for those children. When she passed, it was a great sadness, and that cousin of hers, Ricardo, I never trusted him, showed up out of nowhere, all helpful, but you can feel bad people from a mile away. The conversation was cut short by the approach of 2 hostile-looking men, the same ones Arthur had seen on the motorcycle. They stopped at a calculated distance, staring at Mrs. Rosa with cold eyes. The old woman immediately fell silent, lowered her head, and began to arrange her sweets with a sudden nervousness. The message was clear. The community knew, but they were afraid. A network of silence, enforced by terror, kept the children trapped and protected Ricardo. Arthur understood he wasn't just fighting a man, but the fear he and his cronies had sown. To free Mia and Leo, he would have to break that silence. But how do you ask people who have nothing to risk the little they have for a cause that isn't theirs? The image of Mrs. Rosa cowering under the gaze of Ricardo's thugs haunted Arthur. That fear was a wall higher than any legal barrier. He returned to his world of glass and steel, but the smell of that neighborhood, the dust and despair, remained ingrained in his clothes, in his memory. He realized with desolate clarity that he couldn't fight this battle from his ivory tower. To break the silence, he had to build trust, and trust was a currency his money couldn't buy. It would have to be earned, gesture by gesture, look by look. This realization both terrified and drew him in. That night, he dismissed the housekeeper early. He wanted to be alone with the children. Leo was already asleep in his crib, but Mia was sitting on the rug, trying with her small fingers to braid her doll's hair. She sighed in frustration with each failed attempt. Arthur sat on the floor beside her, a gesture that would have been unthinkable for the man he was weeks ago. "Want some help?" he asked. Mia looked at him suspiciously, then shrugged and handed him the doll. Arthur's hands, used to signing multi-million-dollar contracts and holding crystal glasses, were coarse and clumsy with the yarn strands of the doll's hair. He tried once, twice, 3 times, and the result was always a misshapen tangle. Mia watched in silence, and then a small laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't a laugh of mockery, but of pure delight. "You don't know how," she stated, with the brutal honesty of children. Arthur laughed too, a genuine, relaxed sound. "No, I don't. I guess I never had to learn." He put the doll down. "But my daddy did," Mia said suddenly, her voice a whisper full of nostalgia. "My real daddy. Ben." It was the first time she had spoken his name. He had big hands, all calloused from work, but he made the most beautiful braid in my hair. He said it was so I would look like Mommy. The memory was so vivid that Arthur could almost see the scene. A big, gentle man, his hands marked by labor, tenderly caring for his little girl. It was an image of pure love, a world away from Ricardo's opportunism. "He sounded like a good man, Mia," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was the best," she replied, her eyes shining. Just then, the apartment phone rang, the shrill sound shattering the peaceful moment. Arthur got up to answer, assuming it was one of his lawyers with an update. "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a drawling, sarcastic voice. Well, the millionaire is playing house." It was Ricardo. Arthur's heart leapt. "How did you get this number?" "I have my ways," Ricardo mocked. "Listen to me, you stuck-up rich boy. I heard you've been snooping around my neighborhood asking questions. You better stop, and you better stop filling Mia's head with nonsense. She's mine. Leo is mine. They're my family." "They're nothing to you, you maggot," Arthur hissed, his hatred spilling over. "I know everything. I know about Ben and Claudia." There was a silence on the other end, followed by a low, threatening laugh. "You don't know anything. Want a tip? Ask Mia what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong. Ask her if she wants you to disappear too." Before Arthur could respond, the line went dead. He turned, terrified, and saw Mia standing in the hallway, pale as wax. She had heard. He approached her, panic seizing him. "Mia, what did he mean?" Her eyes were empty, distant. She took a step back, a gesture that wounded him more than any blow. "He said," she whispered, her voice trembling, "that you'll get tired of us, that you'll leave, like everyone else." Mia's words, "like everyone else," struck Arthur with the precision of a stiletto, piercing the armor he'd spent a lifetime forging and touching the raw, open wound of his own childhood. For an instant, he wasn't the powerful millionaire in control. He was the frightened little boy again, left behind, staring at a door that would never reopen. That primal fear, the terror of abandonment, was a poison he knew intimately. He saw that same poison spread across Mia's eyes, and the pain he felt was not for himself, but for her. Ricardo, in his calculated cruelty, hadn't just threatened their physical safety. He had attacked the fragile foundation of trust Arthur was trying to build. He knelt on the floor, bringing himself to her level, a gesture of submission to her pain. He wanted to shout that he would never leave her, that he was different, but the words felt empty in the face of such profound fear. How do you promise forever to a child who has only ever known temporary? "Mia, look at me," he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion he didn't bother to hide. She raised her face reluctantly, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know what you're feeling," he continued, the confession leaving him vulnerable in a way no risky business deal ever had. "I know that fear. Of waiting for someone who doesn't come back. Of thinking you're not important enough for them to stay." He didn't tell her the whole story, didn't speak of the details of his own loneliness, but he gave her the only thing he could, the truth of his feeling. When I was a little older than you, I felt that way too, alone, and I promised myself that I would never, ever make another person feel that way. He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as an invitation. I am not them, Mia. I'm not going anywhere. You and Leo, you are important to me. The sincerity in his voice, the shared pain in his eyes, seemed to reach something inside her. Slowly, she took a step forward and hugged him, a small, desperate embrace that said everything words could not. He held her tightly, feeling the weight of that promise solidify in his heart. It was no longer a matter of choice, it was a duty of the soul. Later, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Arthur's fury returned, but now it was cold and analytical. Ricardo's phone call wasn't just an act of intimidation, it was a probe, a test to measure the depth of Arthur's emotional investment. Ricardo was a predator, and like all predators, he was sizing up the value of his prey. Arthur's mind, trained to dissect negotiations, began to see a sick pattern. Ricardo didn't want the children. He saw them as an asset, a resource to be exploited, first through welfare checks, then through veiled extortion, now through psychological warfare. Each step was an escalation to extract more value. A terrible, repulsive thought began to form in Arthur's mind. A possibility so obscene it made him nauseous, but one that, at the same time, seemed to hold a perverse logic. If Ricardo saw the children as a commodity, maybe he would be willing to sell them. The idea was monstrous, but it fit the man's profile perfectly. The phone rang again, and he answered with his heart in his throat. It wasn't Ricardo. It was his lawyer, Mr. Hayes. The lawyer's voice was tense. Arthur, I've just received the strangest call of my career. It was a man who introduced himself as Ricardo's legal representative. Arthur held his breath. And what did he want? There was a pause on the other end of the line. He said his client is tired of legal battles, that he believes the children would be better off with you, given your obvious affection and superior resources. He is willing to permanently relinquish all paternal rights and disappear from their lives forever. Arthur felt a flicker of hope. But, Mr. Hayes continued, his voice laced with disgust, in exchange, he demands a substantial and final financial compensation for his emotional distress and loss. Arthur, he's putting a price on them. He wants you to buy them. Ricardo's proposal, relayed by the strained voice of Mr. Hayes, hung in the air like a toxic gas. Arthur felt a wave of revulsion so intense he had to sit down. It wasn't the demand for money that shocked him. He was accustomed to aggressive negotiations and human greed. It was the profanity of the act, to put a price on two souls, to turn love and protection into a market transaction. It was moral degradation in its purest, most absolute form. He's not selling his right to be a father. He's selling the children themselves, Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. The answer is no. Obviously no. Mr. Hayes let out a sigh of relief. I figured as much, Arthur, but I had to present the offer to go through with. This would be a felony. You'd be charged with human trafficking. You would lose any chance of getting legal custody, and worse, you'd lose the children forever. They'd go into the system, and you'd go to jail. The logic was cold, brutal, and irrefutable. But for a split second, Arthur's calculating mind, the businessman he'd always been, saw the shortcut. Pay the money. Get Ricardo out of the picture. Ensure the children's immediate safety. It was a fast, efficient solution. An old voice inside him whispered that everything had a price, but that voice was immediately silenced by a new, stronger one, the voice that had learned to recognize the sound of Leo's laugh and the touch of Mia's hand in his. To pay Ricardo would be to validate his methods, to reward his cruelty, and in a way, to agree that the children were in fact a commodity. It would be a betrayal of the promise he had made to Mia. He returned to the apartment that night with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The housekeeper had already left. Leo was asleep, but the lamp on Mia's desk was still on. He walked in and found her asleep at her desk, her head resting on her arms. Beside her was a sheet of paper. His eyes fell on the drawing. It was a child's drawing, with the vibrant colors and imperfect shapes of childhood. In the center, a tall figure in a suit with an awkward smile held hands with a little girl with braids and a small boy. A yellow sun smiled in the corner of the page, and a big, beautiful house filled the background. Above the male figure, in shaky, effortful handwriting, Mia had written, "Daddy Arthur." The air seemed to have been sucked from his lungs. Daddy, that word, written by the hand of a child he had known for a few short weeks, was more valuable than his entire empire. It was a title he had not bought, but one he was somehow beginning to earn. In that moment, the decision crystallized in his soul. He would not just protect these children, he would fight for them, no matter the cost. He would earn them. He picked up the drawing with infinite care, as if it were the most precious document in the world, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. His phone vibrated, an unknown number. He answered. "So, has the rich guy thought about my proposal?" Ricardo's voice was a spit in the quiet of the night. "My lawyers gave you the answer," Arthur said, his voice like ice. Ricardo laughed, a hollow, unpleasant sound. "Wrong answer, sucker. I gave you a chance to solve this the easy way, a chance to have your little Hallmark movie family. But since you want to make it hard, you should know there are other interested parties, people who don't ask so many questions. Think about it. The clock is ticking, and the price might go up." The line went dead. The threat was clear. If Arthur didn't buy them, he would sell them to someone else, perhaps to someone with far worse intentions. Panic and fury mingled into a toxic cocktail. But amidst the chaos, a dangerous idea began to form, an idea that would use Ricardo's own greed as a weapon against him. He wouldn't buy the children, but maybe he could pretend to. He picked up the phone and didn't call his lawyers. He called Silas, the investigator. "Silas, I need you. Ricardo made a proposal. I want to accept it." There was a shocked silence on the other end. "Mr. Sterling, that's—" Arthur cut him off. "I'm not paying him a cent, Silas. We're going to play his game, but by my rules. I want you to set a trap, the biggest trap of his life." The plan was risky, a tightrope walk over a legal and moral abyss, but it was the only card Arthur had left to play. He felt like a general preparing for the final battle, every move meticulously calculated. Ricardo's greed was his greatest weakness, and that was exactly where Arthur would strike. With the help of Silas and his corporate security team, he orchestrated the scene. The exchange would happen in person, at a location of Arthur's choosing, an abandoned warehouse in an industrial zone, a neutral environment that could be easily monitored. Tiny cameras and microphones were installed in strategic spots, invisible to the untrained eye. The sum Ricardo demanded, an exorbitant amount, was prepared in marked bills and placed in an ordinary-looking briefcase. The police were notified, but unofficially through one of Silas's high-ranking contacts. They would be on standby at a safe distance, waiting for the signal. The most tense moment wouldn't be the exchange itself, but what came before it. The confession. Arthur needed Ricardo, in his own voice, to admit what he was doing, to admit he wasn't the father, that he was selling the children. This was the irrefutable proof the lawyers so desperately needed. The day arrived, grey and oppressive, mirroring Arthur's state of mind. He said goodbye to Mia and Leo with a tighter-than-usual hug. "I'll be back soon," he promised, and he saw a trust in Mia's eyes that both strengthened and terrified him. Failure was not an option. In the warehouse, the air was cold and smelled of mold and rust. Silas was in a nearby van, monitoring the feeds. Arthur was alone, the briefcase of money at his feet. Ricardo arrived punctually, flanked by his two usual thugs. The smile on his face was one of pure triumph. "I like to see it, a businessman who knows a good offer when he sees one," he said, his eyes fixed on the briefcase. Arthur remained calm, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Before I give you the money, I need a guarantee, a written, signed confession that you're relinquishing all rights and will never come near them again." Ricardo laughed. "A piece of paper? You think I care about paper? The money is my guarantee. And mine is your word," Arthur countered, switching on a disguised voice recorder in his pocket. "I need to hear it from you, Ricardo, for my own records, that the children are not yours, that you are handing them over to me in exchange for this money." Ricardo hesitated for a moment, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But the sight of the briefcase, the smell of the money, was too powerful a lure. His arrogance won. "Of course. They're not my damn kids," he spat the words with disdain. "You think I'd have kids? Their father was a loser and their mother was sick. I did them a favor taking them in, a favor that cost me. Now you're going to pay for that favor. They're yours. Do what you want with them. Sell them, adopt them, make them disappear. I don't care. Just give me my money." Every word was a stab, but it was also a victory. It was all on tape. Arthur bent down to open the briefcase, the moment of truth approaching. It was then that everything went wrong. Outside, a siren wailed, distant but rapidly approaching. It wasn't the standby police. It was another patrol car arriving too soon, tipped off by some anonymous call. Panic flashed across Ricardo's face. "You set me up!" One of his thugs pulled something from his waistband. The tension exploded, but the catalyst for the resolution came from the most unexpected source. From the shadow of a concrete pillar, a small figure emerged. It was Mia. She had hidden in the back of Arthur's car, too terrified to be left behind. In her hands, she clutched her mother's broken music box. Her eyes, however, showed no fear. They showed a fury and a courage that transcended her age. She looked directly at Ricardo. "You're not going to hurt us anymore," she said, her voice small but firm as steel. "You're not our father. Our father was good." And then she opened the music box. It played no melody, but from inside, she pulled a tiny memory card, the one Silas had given her days before, teaching her how to use the recorder on an old phone he'd given her to capture Ricardo's conversations at home. "I recorded you too," she said, with devastating simplicity, "talking to your friends about everything. The bravery of that child, testifying against the man who should have protected her, was the final blow that brought the entire house of cards crashing down." The moment following Mia's declaration was one of absolute heavy silence. The memory card in the little girl's hand seemed more powerful than any weapon. Ricardo and his thugs were frozen, their bluff called by the unexpected courage of their youngest victim. The imminent arrival of the police, signaled by the ever louder sirens, broke the spell. Panic gave way to desperate action. The two thugs, seeing the situation was lost, turned and fled, disappearing through an exit at the back of the warehouse. Ricardo, however, remained. For a moment, he looked from Arthur to Mia, his face a mask of hate and disbelief. He seemed ready to explode, to commit one last act of violence, but then something in his expression shattered. Perhaps it was the sight of Mia's unwavering resolve, or the weight of his own crimes finally catching up to him. He collapsed, not physically, but inwardly. The arrogance drained away, leaving only a hollow, defeated man. When the police stormed the warehouse, he offered no resistance. He let them handcuff him in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if the weight of the world had finally settled on his shoulders. Arthur rushed to Mia, wrapping her in a protective embrace, her body trembling with a delayed rush of adrenaline. "You were so brave," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with admiration and relief. "The bravest person I know." The evidence was overwhelming. Arthur's recording, combined with Mia's memory card and Silas's investigations, painted an irrefutable picture of extortion, endangerment, fraud, and child exploitation. The network of silence in the community broke. With Ricardo in custody, people like Mrs. Rosa finally felt safe enough to testify, telling stories of neglect and the illegal activities they had witnessed, the web of corruption that had protected Ricardo in the justice system also began to unravel under the scrutiny of the media, which Arthur, through his contacts, made sure to involve. The reluctant judge was removed from the case, and a new one, a woman known for her integrity and dedication to children's causes, took over. The outcome in court was swift and decisive. Ricardo was sentenced to a long prison term, not just for his crimes against Arthur, but for the web of offenses his greed had woven. The narrative arcs of the antagonists closed behind bars. For Arthur, Mia, and Leo, the resolution was even more profound. With no other relatives and proof that Ricardo was an imposter, the path to adoption was clear. It wasn't an instantaneous process. It required patience, interviews, and evaluations. But Arthur faced every step with the same determination he had used to protect the children. He was no longer fighting a villain. He was building a future. He sold his sterile, impersonal penthouse and bought a large house with a yard where Leo could run and a tree strong enough for a swing, just as Mia had always dreamed. He drastically cut back his hours at the office, delegating responsibilities and discovering that the joy of watching Mia in a school play was worth more than any billion-dollar merger. He learned to cook, not gourmet dishes, but the simple foods the children loved. He learned to fix broken toys and kiss scraped knees. He was, piece by piece, becoming the father he never had and the father they had lost. The suffering of the past wasn't erased, but it was being transformed into a foundation of empathy and love. The wound of abandonment in his own heart was finally healing, filled by the unconditional love of his new family. The journey of overcoming was complete, not with a grand, heroic gesture, but in the quiet, sacred routine of a happy home. 6 weeks after that stifling Thursday afternoon, Arthur Sterling's life was unrecognizable. The man who had stormed out of a tense meeting, irritated with the world and encapsulated in his own indifference, no longer existed. In his place was a father who, on this Saturday morning, was on his knees in the grass, his hands dirty with soil, helping Leo, now a sturdy and talkative little boy, plant a small sunflower seedling in the garden. Mia, sitting on a new swing that creaked gently, read a book aloud, her diction clear and confident. The house, once an architectural project, was now a home, with children's drawings held by magnets on the refrigerator and toys scattered across the living room. The silence had been replaced by laughter, the sound of little feet running down the hall, and lively dinner conversations. The transformation was complete, a redemption he hadn't sought, but which had found him in the form of 2 desperate children. But the change didn't stop at the gates of his new home. The traumatic experience they had lived through planted a seed of social responsibility in Arthur that blossomed into a greater purpose. He knew that Mia and Leo were just 2 among countless children trapped in similar cycles of neglect and abuse. His fortune, which once served only to amplify his comfort, now had a new mission. He returned to that rundown neighborhood, not as an intruder, but as a partner. With the help of Mrs. Rosa and other residents who now saw him with respect and gratitude, he funded the construction of a community center. It wasn't a top-down charity project, it was a collaboration. The center, named the Ben and Claudia House, offered tutoring, sports activities, psychological support, and most importantly, a safe harbor for vulnerable children. It was run by the residents themselves, creating jobs and a sense of ownership that mere handouts could never provide. The final scene unfolds a few months later at the center's inauguration. Arthur is there, not on the dais with the politicians and dignitaries, but in the crowd, with Leo on his shoulders and Mia's hand in his. He is no longer the indifferent millionaire, but a member of that community, bound to it by a tie of shared humanity. Mia, retaining her natural strength but now confident and educated, had become a small leader in her own right. She organized a group of older kids to identify and welcome newcomers to the center, ensuring no one felt alone or afraid to ask for help. She was living proof that the courage of a single voice can awaken many others. Arthur watched her, his heart overflowing with a pride that was deep and serene. He had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. True wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what you share. It's in using your resources, whether financial or emotional, to transform lives, to break chains of suffering, and to build bridges where there were once walls. The children in turn discovered that their courage had not only saved their own lives, but had also rescued the lost humanity in a man who had everything but the one thing that mattered. The apartment where they had once lived in misery and fear was just a distant memory. Their new home, the house with the garden and the swing, was proof that true family isn't defined by blood, but is forged in mutual care, sacrifice, and the unwavering commitment to protect one another. A little girl's desperate plea on a dirty street had not led him to a problem, but to his purpose. And in the quiet of that festive afternoon, amid the sound of playing children, Arthur Sterling, the father, finally felt at home.